Hey there, this is Fritz Westover, your viticulturist here at Virtual Viticulture Academy, and you can listen in also anytime on the Vineyard Underground podcast. And I've got some questions that I've been getting in from growers. I wanted to share this one with you because I'm hoping it will help more growers out there. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull up a picture from a grower who sent me some symptoms they were seeing in their vineyard from Oklahoma. And one of the things that's interesting about this one is that the vineyard wasn't showing symptoms drastically until later in the season. So let's take a closer look. This grower in Oklahoma was seeing this leaf scorch that was on the bottoms of their shoots. So in other words, near veraison or as they're approaching harvest, these symptoms started to appear. Now, their first gut reaction was maybe they had Pierce's disease, because Pierce's disease shows up with symptoms of leaf scorch. And certainly there is some leaf scorch happening in this photo. But what we notice about this and what struck me is that the leaf scorch is really not moving all the way up the shoot like it would with Pierce's disease. It's kind of limited to the older leaves only. So there's several things that can do this kind of or make this kind of symptom in late season on older leaves. It could be Pierce's disease, that it's running up the entire shoot, or the entire vine is showing symptoms of leaf scorch and matchstick petioles, and some green islands as the periderm is not hardening evenly, or maybe even berry shrivel. But we're not seeing all those symptoms. We're seeing leaf scorch, but it's only on the older leaves. So that means it could be a mobile nutrient deficiency, such as potassium or magnesium. But the symptoms aren't really clear for that either, because we don't see the marginal yellowing or necrosis that we see with potassium, and we don't see the interveinal necrosis that you'd see with magnesium. And I think the main point here is that we see it mostly in the older leaves. And as the season progressed and they were watering more during the heat, they started to see the symptoms getting even worse. Now, this vine is obviously holding probably more fruit than it needs to. So it's already stressed because of that. It could be heat stress and crop stress that's causing symptoms like this. But in this case, because they started to see the symptoms earlier, like we were showing here, and they progressed as the season went on, even on vines that didn't have a heavy crop load, I had asked the grower if they had recently sampled their irrigation water. And the answer was no. And the reason we wanted to look into this is because irrigation water with high salts, high total dissolved solids, high sodium absorption ratio, or high boron content can cause symptoms like this as you get into drought periods in the season. And this year, the grower was experiencing a drought that lasted about 8 weeks, and they were watering on a regular basis, and the symptoms worsened as they went over time. They tried to increase the number of days they were watering, thinking maybe it was heat stress or drought stress, but that actually made the symptoms worse. So when they sampled the water from their well, sent it to the lab, this is what we were able to see. Okay, I have some guidelines from the University of California Cooperative Extension Service here to show what the appropriate levels or toxic levels of certain salts might be. That's shown below, and above is the results. So this is the report from our water results. The grower says, do any of these look like they could cause the leaf symptoms we saw at the end of the season? And the answer is undeniably yes. So when we look at the pH of the water, it's a little on the high side. That in itself is not an issue. That means that the grower probably has high calcium content and will probably need to inject acid occasionally to clean their lines and just be concerned about clogging the lines. But that's not what causes the problem in the leaf scorch. We look at the total dissolved solids, or salts, some people will say, and that is at 600 parts per million. So we get onto the table here, and you can see that down here, once we get above 450 parts per million, we can start to see elevated salt levels or damage. In fact, if you get up to about 750 parts per million of TDS in your water report, that means for about every acre foot of water you put out, you're putting out about a ton per acre of salts, which you wouldn't want to do in a normal vineyard, because we all know sodium and some other, and chloride, for example, are not good for vine growth. Grapes are very sensitive. So this is a little bit elevated, but I've worked with many vineyards that haven't had issues with this level of total dissolved solids, as long as there's seasonal rain to flush those salts out of the soil, because the salts are soluble and they'll move with rainwater well below the root zone, and that will reduce the amount that's taken up by roots. Now we look at the boron levels over here, 1.19 milligrams per liter. That's the same as parts per million. And we see in our chart anything over 0.5 is elevated. And in my experience, when we get up to 1 or 2 parts per million of boron, if we're only using irrigation water and don't get fresh, clean rainwater occasionally to run through the soil and flush out or drain out or push down that boron, we can get accumulation and uptake. So certainly boron could be involved in what we're seeing in those leaf symptoms. But the biggest thing is the sodium adsorption ratio, or the adjusted SAR, which is at 9.63. And this is really a mathematical equation of the salt's content and its availability for uptake by roots based on the whole cation exchange. And what we see here is that the SAR adjusted is over 9. And down here in our guidelines, once we get over 9, we start to see issues. So undoubtedly, we know that the water quality is the problem for the scorch in this vineyard. It doesn't match the symptoms of nutritional deficiency. The plant tissue test they did showed nutritional content was normal in leaf content at veraison. We also saw that there were no Pierce's disease symptoms, at least in these vines that we're showing in photos. So one thing that I want to make sure that I'm clear about is that this problem is not a deal breaker necessarily for a vineyard. This is not a problem that means the grower has to remove the vines. But what it does mean is that they have to be very careful about the way that they're watering their vineyards. If they are watering multiple times a week, 3 or 4 or 5 times a week, but very shallow, the salts can accumulate in the shallow soil. And let's say they're watering down to 12 inches or 15 centimeters, and all of the salts are lingering there. If those salts don't move lower below the root zone, you get accumulation and you get toxic conditions for roots, and you get the symptoms that we're seeing once again here on those leaves, or here the onset of those symptoms. If the grower gets a good rain event of 1 inch or more, or 3 or 4 centimeters or more, that could be enough to flush those salts or push them below the root zone, and that could help. But one thing the grower could do in this case is when they are watering in between rain events, they could water less frequently, but water deeper. That's going to push the salts down below the root zone, and it's going to ensure that they're not getting that buildup that they're getting from very frequent and shallow watering. So I hope that this has been helpful for anyone out there who's struggling with issues that look similar in their vineyard. If you have symptoms that are showing up that look like salt toxicity, typically they're going to show up later in the season when the stress of the heat of the season comes on, when you have a full canopy out there. And I highly encourage you to get your water tested before you even plant your vineyard. That way you know if you can anticipate or if you need to be preparing yourself for any of these issues later on down the road. And if the salt content of your water is just too high, you might not want to plant a vineyard at all. So I hope this is helpful. If you need more tips on grape growing, you can check out our free grower guide selections at virtualviticultureacademy.com. And you can always listen in anytime on the Vineyard Underground podcast. You can also check that out wherever you listen to your podcast. Take care, and we'll see you on the next one.